Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World, and here is today's content. When I look at Israel's announcement that it has assassinated a senior Hezbollah military commander in Beirut, I do not see this as an isolated tactical operation. I see it as a strategic signal, one that suggests the conflict between Israel, Hezbollah, and the broader axis of resistance has entered a far more dangerous phase. A strike inside Beirut is not merely another exchange of fire along the Israel-Lebanon border. It is a deliberate escalation that challenges the fragile balance that has prevented a full-scale regional war. From my perspective, what makes this event so significant is not the individual targeted, but the context in which the assassination occurred. Hezbollah is not a fringe militia. It is a deeply embedded political and military actor within Lebanon, backed by Iran, and connected to a broad regional network from Syria to Iraq to Yemen. Its senior commanders are central nodes within Iran's deterrence architecture against Israel. By killing one of its top military figures in the heart of Beirut, Israel is sending a message far beyond Lebanon's borders. It is testing the limits of that deterrent structure. Israel, under immense domestic and security pressure, sees these operations as necessary to restore deterrence. To Israeli leaders, eliminating senior figures weakens command structures, disrupts planning, and demonstrates resolve. But I have long argued that deterrence through assassination is an inherently unstable strategy. It rests on an assumption that the adversary will absorb the blow rather than retaliate in ways that spiral beyond control. Yet in the Middle East, where narratives of resistance, martyrdom, and honor are deeply ingrained, targeted killings often provoke action rather than restraint. For Hezbollah, the stakes are equally high. A major assassination in Beirut cannot simply be ignored. Its internal legitimacy, its regional standing, and its alliance with Tehran all require some form of response. The danger lies not only in what Hezbollah might do, but in how Israel might interpret any response, whether as a limited retaliatory gesture or as the opening salvo of a wider confrontation. This is precisely the kind of escalation ladder that has historically led the Middle East into wars. Nobody actually intended. Each side acts based on its own logic, its own domestic pressures, its own sense of vulnerability, and each side misreads the intentions of the other. What should be a contained tactical move becomes an existential challenge. What should be a limited reply becomes a supposed signal of broader aggression. In my analysis, Israel's operation inside Beirut is a reminder of how close the region remains to a broader conflagration. The Middle East today is heavily militarized, politically fractured, and saturated with proxy networks. A single assassination under these conditions carries far more weight than the individuals involved. It represents a test, a provocation, and a potential turning point. Whether this action triggers widespread escalation will depend not only on what Israel and Hezbollah do next, but on how Iran, the Gulf states, and global powers interpret the meaning of this moment. The danger is unmistakable, and so is the need for restraint. On the Israeli side, domestic political incentives also play a powerful role. Israeli leaders operate under immense public expectation to demonstrate strength, particularly after periods of insecurity or political fragmentation. They often perceive decisive action, particularly against Hezbollah, as essential for rebuilding deterrence. But deterrence is not rebuilt simply by demonstrating the capacity to strike. It must also be built on predictable behavior and a clear understanding by both sides of red lines. Assassinations blur those lines rather than clarify them. This is where I see the greatest danger misreading intentions. Israel may view the assassination as a contained tactical message. Hezbollah may interpret it as a prelude to a broader campaign. Hezbollah may choose a limited retaliatory strike intended to signal resolve. Israel may interpret it as the beginning of escalation. This reciprocal misinterpretation has time and again dragged the region into conflicts neither side originally sought. The broader regional atmosphere amplifies the risk. Lebanese society is in deep economic collapse. Hezbollah operates in a fragile political environment where regional actors, including Iran and Syria, have their own calculations. Israel, meanwhile, faces domestic instability, factional tensions, and ongoing security pressures across Gaza, the West Bank, and the northern border. An environment of political insecurity on both sides increases the likelihood of risky decisions. And then there is the wider context. The Middle East today is not a set of isolated conflicts. It is a web of interconnected fronts. Iraq's militias respond to events in Lebanon. Yemen's Houthis interpret Israeli actions through their own anti-Israel posture. Iran sees any strike on Hezbollah as a test of its own credibility. The United States, with military assets across the region, becomes a potential target for indirect retaliation. As these networks react, an incident that begins in Beirut can ripple into Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and even the Persian Gulf. When I look at this picture, I conclude that escalation is not inevitable, but it is structurally likely unless there is deliberate restraint. The region lacks a stable security architecture crisis, hotlines, or mutual frameworks for de-escalation. Absent such mechanisms, actors fall back on symbolic responses, emotional calculations, and worst-case assumptions. Thus, yes, Israel's killing of a senior Hezbollah commander is highly likely to intensify tensions, not because one side seeks war, but because the equilibrium itself has become dangerously fragile. When I examine Iran's position in the aftermath of Israel's assassination of a senior Hezbollah commander, I am struck by the extraordinary complexity of Tehran's strategic calculus. Iran is not simply another observer in this crisis. Hezbollah is the most important pillar of what Iran calls its axis of resistance, a network of partners and proxies designed to deter Israel and project Iranian influence across the region. A blow to Hezbollah's command structure is therefore, in Tehran's eyes, a blow to Iran itself. From this perspective, Iran faces a familiar dilemma to retaliate and risk escalation, or to exercise strategic patience and risk appearing weak. And the stakes are not symbolic. They cut to the heart of Iran's regional strategy and domestic legitimacy. I see three broad pathways Iran may pursue. One, calibrated retaliation through Hezbollah. The most likely option is a limited response coordinated with Hezbollah. Iran may encourage Hezbollah to carry out a measured counterstrike, perhaps a precision rocket attack on a military target, or a drone strike against Israeli infrastructure close to the border. The goal would be to signal resolve without triggering a full-scale war. Why would Iran choose this? Because doing nothing would damage the credibility of its deterrent system. Tehran's entire regional posture depends on the perception that attacks on its partners will be answered. But Iran also knows that a major confrontation with Israel, especially one involving direct Iranian involvement, could draw in the United States, jeopardize Iranian infrastructure, and destabilize the regime during a period of internal economic strain. A calibrated counterattack offers Tehran a middle ground respond, but avoid uncontrolled escalation. Two, multi-front pressure without open conflict. A second option is what I call the distributed retaliation model. Iran may activate multiple allied groups, Iraqi militias, Syrian paramilitary units, and Yemen's Houthis to apply pressure on Israel or U.S. interests in the region. This approach allows Iran to avoid taking direct responsibility, diffuse Israeli retaliation across multiple fronts, and remind Washington that escalation in Lebanon can endanger U.S. troops across the Middle East. This is a strategy of deterrence by complication, making any response by Israel or the U.S. costly, unpredictable, and regionally dispersed. 3. Strategic patience coupled with diplomatic and cyber measures. The third option is strategic restraint. Iran may choose to wait, calculating that Hezbollah will respond at a time of its choosing, not at a moment dictated by Israel. Tehran has used this strategy before, particularly when its leadership believes Israel is attempting to provoke a broader conflict. In such a case, Iran could emphasize cyber operations, symbolic diplomatic messages, intelligence preparation for a future strike, or internal consolidation within Hezbollah's command structure. Strategic patience is often misunderstood. It is not weakness. It is a recognition that Iran's long-term goal is regional influence without a catastrophic war. My conclusion, in my judgment, Iran will not seek a large-scale confrontation. It will, however, ensure that Israel's strike does not go unanswered. The most probable outcome is a controlled Hezbollah retaliation accompanied by broader regional pressure and Iranian diplomatic messaging. But even a controlled response is dangerous in an environment as volatile as today's Middle East. One miscalculation, one misread action, or one unintended casualty could pull the region into a wider conflict, despite Iran's preference for caution. This is the fragile equilibrium. We now face a region where every actor wants to avoid war, yet every action pushes them closer to it. When I look beyond Israel, Hezbollah, and Iran, I see an even broader and more delicate landscape emerging across the Middle East. The assassination in Beirut does not occur in a vacuum. It ripples through a region where states are pursuing divergent agendas, balancing domestic pressures, strategic alliances, and the shifting geometry of global power. What worries me most is that every regional actor interprets this event through its own lens, and those interpretations can amplify instability. Let me begin with the Arab states, particularly Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf monarchies. These governments, despite their deep historical grievances with Israel, are not eager to see a regional war erupt. Their economies are fragile. They depend on trade routes, energy markets, and investor confidence. A destabilized Lebanon or a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran threatens all of that. Yet the same governments must navigate intense public anger toward Israel, especially when violence escalates in Lebanon or Palestine. This creates a political bind. Officially, they want de-escalation. Politically, they must maintain a posture that does not appear complicit with Israeli actions. Saudi Arabia's position is especially complex. Riyadh is trying to balance its ongoing negotiations with the United States, its tentative moves toward normalization with Israel, and its strategic rivalry with Iran. A major war would undermine Vision 2030, derail investment flows, and threaten energy infrastructure. So Saudi Arabia will publicly condemn Israel, but privately seek to restrain both sides from Hezbollah's retaliation to Israel's deeper incursions. The United Arab Emirates faces a similar dilemma. It has normalized relations with Israel, but remains acutely aware that a regional conflict could harm its position as the region's financial hub. The UAE will likely push for diplomacy, knowing that instability threatens its economic model. Moving to Turkey, I see another actor positioning itself strategically President Erdogan often uses Middle Eastern crises to boost Turkey's diplomatic profile. Ankara may offer mediation between Lebanon, Iran, and Western powers, not purely out of altruism, but because it strengthens Turkey's claim to leadership in a multipolar Middle East. At the same time, Turkey will avoid direct confrontation with Israel or Iran. Its priority is economic stabilization and maintaining its influence in Syria. Qatar, with its long-standing ties to multiple regional factions, may also step forward as a mediator. Doha thrives in situations where it can leverage diplomacy to amplify its international role. It will likely open back channels with Hezbollah and Iran seeking to position itself as a stabilizing force. But perhaps the greatest danger lies in the proxy networks crisscrossing the region. Iranian-linked groups in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen do not always operate with perfectly synchronized control. A militia commander in Iraq or a Houthi unit in Yemen may decide, based on their own motivations, to retaliate for the Beirut assassination, dragging Iran into deeper involvement, even if Tehran prefers restraint. Israel, interpreting these actions as coordinated attacks, might escalate further. The United States, with troops throughout Iraq and Syria, becomes exposed to retaliatory strikes that it must answer. This is how a localized incident becomes a regional conflict. In this sense, the Middle East resembles a tightly wound web pull, one strand in Beirut, and vibrations are felt in Baghdad, Sana'a, Damascus, and Riyadh. The assassination has heightened the tension in that web, and every actor, state or non-state, now calculates its position with heightened anxiety. My fear is that the region lacks the diplomatic infrastructure needed to contain such shocks. Without functioning regional security forums, without trusted mediators, without crisis hotlines, every actor is guessing the intentions of others. And in a region as fractured as the Middle East, miscalculation is often the spark that ignites the fire. When I consider the economic implications of Israel's assassination of a senior Hezbollah commander, I immediately recognize how fragile the regional and global economic environment truly is. The Middle East has long been the world's most sensitive geopolitical pressure point, not only because of its conflicts, but because of its centrality to energy markets, global trade routes, and investor psychology. A sudden escalation between Israel and Hezbollah is enough to send tremors through every major financial center. The first effect is psychological, but extremely powerful risk premiums spike instantly. Markets do not wait for a full-scale war. They react to the possibility of one. Insurers raise rates for ships passing through the eastern Mediterranean. Traders mark up the price of Brent crude. Investors begin shifting capital into safe haven assets, U.S. treasuries, gold, the Swiss franc anticipating volatility. Even when physical supply is not disrupted, sheer uncertainty drives prices. Energy markets are especially exposed. If Hezbollah retaliates in a way that targets Israeli infrastructure, or if Israel expands the conflict into Syria or Western Iraq, there is a real risk of spillover toward the Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 1/5 of global oil passes, lies within the reach of Iranian-aligned groups. Even a symbolic threat to Hormuz can push oil above crisis levels. For Europe, still reeling from the Ukraine war's energy shock, a Middle Eastern escalation could trigger renewed inflation, manufacturing slowdowns, and political instability. Natural gas markets face similar vulnerability. The Eastern Mediterranean has become an emerging energy corridor, with the Israeli offshore fields feeding regional and European demand. A regional war would likely disrupt operations, or at least halt investment in new gas projects. Investors become wary when the security environment deteriorates. long-term energy planning collapses under the weight of short-term unpredictability, the domestic economic impact on Lebanon would be catastrophic. Lebanon is already suffering one of the worst financial collapses in modern history: hyperinflation, a banking system in ruins, mass emigration, and a dysfunctional state. A major conflict involving Hezbollah would devastate what remains of Lebanon's productive economy. Ports, infrastructure, and urban centers could be damaged or shut down. Refugee flows would surge. The international community, fatigued by multiple crises, may not have the will or resources to support Lebanon through another collapse. And this is not just Lebanon's problem. Refugee flows from Lebanon would immediately affect Cyprus, Turkey, Jordan, and Europe. Every destabilized state in the Middle East generates secondary pressures that ripple outward migration, security vacuums, smuggling networks, and humanitarian crises that spill across borders. For Israel, escalation would also impose significant economic costs. Tourism would collapse. Foreign investment would slow as companies reconsider exposure to a region on the brink of war. Military mobilization strains public budgets. Prolonged conflict could even undermine Israel's high-tech sector, which depends on a stable business environment and global investor confidence. The United States, too, faces risk. Oil shocks feed inflationary pressure. U.S. forces stationed across Iraq, Syria, Kuwait, and the Gulf become targets for proxy retaliation, potentially dragging Washington deeper into conflict and disrupting global economic recovery. In this interconnected web, a single assassination, far from being a local event, can act as a trigger point for global economic anxiety. From where I stand as an economist, the calculus is clear. A wider confrontation does not serve the economic interests of any actor: Israel, Lebanon, Iran, the Gulf, Europe, or the global economy. But conflict is not driven by economic rationality alone. It is driven by fear, deterrence, domestic politics, and miscalculation. And that is precisely why the economic stakes are so dangerously high. When I shift my lens from the regional actors to the international arena, I see a diplomatic landscape that is both fragmented and deeply constrained. The assassination in Beirut does not merely challenge the regional balance, it places major global powers in a position where every move is consequential, yet none possess a coherent strategy capable of containing escalation. This is the hallmark of a multipolar world in disorder. Let me begin with the United States, whose role is the most paradoxical. Washington is Israel's closest ally and security guarantor, yet it desperately wants to avoid a regional war that would endanger its own forces across Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf U.S. Bases are always the first targets for Iranian-aligned groups seeking to send a message. So the U.S. finds itself performing a contradictory dance, publicly reinforcing its support for Israel while privately pressing for restraint. In my view, this duality reflects a broader American dilemma. The U.S. wants to maintain influence over Middle Eastern security, but its strategic bandwidth is stretched thin, facing competition with China, the war in Ukraine, and deep domestic division. A major Israel-Hezbollah conflict risks pulling Washington into yet another open-ended confrontation, draining resources and political capital. Turning to Europe, I see a bloc deeply uneasy with the situation, but lacking unity and leverage. European states, particularly France, Italy, and Germany, have troops stationed in Lebanon under UNIFIL. They understand that escalation could place their personnel at risk and destabilize the fragile Mediterranean region. Yet Europe today lacks a coherent foreign policy instrument capable of restraining Israel or influencing Hezbollah. The EU will call for de-escalation, humanitarian aid, and diplomatic channels, but its capacity to shape events on the ground is limited. Russia views this crisis through another lens entirely. Moscow positions itself as a critic of U.S. Middle East strategy, framing American security guarantees as a source of regional instability. Russia benefits politically when U.S. influence appears weakened or overextended, but Moscow's actual ability to mediate is constrained by its commitments in Ukraine and its diminished economic resources. Still, Russia may attempt to leverage its presence in Syria, offering symbolic support to Hezbollah or Iran to complicate U.S. calculations. China, although less directly involved, plays a subtle but emerging role. Beijing has sought to position itself as a peacemaker in the Middle East, most notably through its mediation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. A destabilized region threatens China's energy security and its Belt and Road investments. While China will avoid taking sides, it will likely call for de-escalation and use diplomatic channels to urge Iran toward restraint. Beijing's broader goal is stability, not ideological alignment. Finally, we have the United Nations, which possesses the legitimacy to address this crisis, but not the power. The Security Council is paralyzed by geopolitical rivalries. Any meaningful resolution is likely to be blocked by veto. UN agencies can warn of humanitarian consequences and call for dialogue, but they cannot impose a ceasefire or prevent further escalation. What concerns me most as someone who has studied global governance for decades is the absence of a functioning international security framework capable of crisis management. There are no trusted mediators between Israel and Hezbollah, no regional summit architecture, no credible deterrent against miscalculation. The assassination in Beirut has revealed this structural vacuum. And unless global diplomacy rapidly mobilizes, as it rarely does, the world will once again watch a preventable conflict spiral beyond control simply because no institution was strong enough and no great power wise enough to stop it. When I step back and look at the assassination in Beirut, its regional reverberations, its geopolitical stakes, and its economic consequences, I am reminded of a painful truth that has persisted across decades of Middle Eastern conflict. Targeted killings do not break cycles of violence. They reinforce them. They create martyrs, trigger retaliation, and deepen the narratives of grievance and resistance that fuel perpetual instability. What appears tactically decisive in the short term often becomes strategically corrosive over the long term. From where I stand, Israel's assassination of a senior Hezbollah commander is not merely an isolated act of warfighting. It is a symptom of a deeper failure, a failure to build any kind of durable political framework capable of managing hostility, communicating red lines, or establishing even minimal rules of engagement. And without such a framework, the region remains suspended between periodic escalation and fragile pauses, never peace only, interludes between wars. Let me speak plainly, the Middle East lacks a security architecture, something that nearly every other conflict-prone region has attempted to construct. Europe has the OCE and NATO-Russia channels, even if strained. East Asia has a web of bilateral and multilateral mechanisms. Africa has regional peace and security councils. The Middle East has none of these. It has alliances, but not institutions, power, but not dialogue. Israel and Hezbollah communicate through rockets and drones, not through hotlines or crisis centers. Iran and Israel engage in covert war, not structured deterrence agreements. Arab states oscillate between quiet coordination and public condemnation depending on domestic pressures. The United States acts as a guardian of its interests, not as a neutral broker. The international system is present only in rhetoric, absent in practice. Because of this institutional vacuum, every crisis is governed not by rational diplomacy, but by the raw forces of deterrence, fear, and political survival. This is why a single assassination can escalate into a regional conflict. The system has no shock absorbers. What the region desperately needs is a multi-level security dialogue, not a peace treaty, not a grand bargain, but a process. First, Israel and Lebanon must establish channels, direct or indirect, to clarify intentions, prevent misfire, and manage border incidents. Second, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt must be included in broader discussions about proxy warfare militias and red lines. Third, the great powers, especially the US and China, must support such a framework rather than destabilize it through competing regional agendas. None of this is easy, but the alternative is what we see now: a Middle East perpetually hovering on the brink of war, devoid of mechanisms to halt escalation once a crisis begins. Beyond the strategic analysis, there is an ethical dimension I cannot ignore. Every assassination produces a moral distortion. It convinces leaders that security can be achieved by eliminating individuals rather than by addressing underlying causes. It reduces immensely complex issues: occupation, governance failures, sectarian identity, regional power struggles, into a list of targets. And because these deeper issues remain unresolved, new commanders rise, new militias form, new grievances ignite. Violence regenerates itself. True security, in my judgment, cannot come from tactical brilliance or technological superiority. It comes from political inclusion, regional diplomacy, economic opportunities, and a shared recognition of mutual humanity. Until these foundations are built, every assassination, no matter how precise, only deepens the fissures it claims to close. In Beirut today, we see not just the consequences of one strike, but the consequences of decades without a political horizon. If the region wishes to escape this cycle, it must replace targeted killings with targeted diplomacy, vengeance with vision, and fear-driven action with structures of cooperation. Without that shift, the Middle East will remain what it has long been: a region where violence is predictable and peace is perpetually postponed.